Actually, the new book is going to be what I talk about, right? It's out right in time for the holidays, so we'll talk about that at the end. This is lovely, and thank you to the forum, and thank you to Congressman Pittenger for including me. This is my first forum, I hope the first of many. What I thought I would do is, and this is a very hard act to follow generally, but what I thought I would do is try to blow out the frame even a little further, beyond Ukraine, beyond Europe, beyond the Indo-Pacific, and talk about the American national security moment. Because the argument that I would make is that the United States, for probably in the last 2.5 generations, this is the most consequential national security moment. And what I mean by this is that the United States, and by the way, not just me saying this, the last administration in the bipartisan congressionally appointed National Defense Commission, in their final report, they talked about how the pace of threats in the global threat environment is moving so fast that it's challenging to U.S. military deployment, it's even more challenging to U.S. defense industrial production, and it's fraying American alliances. So to try to contextualize what this actually means, the argument I would make is that America's national security moment is unique because America faces not one, not two, but 3 distinct imperial adversaries. And America's a young country, right? We're going to have the 250th anniversary next year. We're going to have UFC fights on the lawns, on the White House lawn. But we have faced imperial adversaries before, for sure, right? The Soviet Union was an imperial adversary, right, of a type. The Third Reich certainly was. Yet, what we now face is this ominous convergence of 3 distinct new imperialists, or renewed imperialists, that are functioning in very unique ways because they are complementary and they're collaborative in a way that we haven't seen before. And what I mean by this is, if you look, and of course here I'm talking about China, Russia, and Iran. And I know that in the public policy space in Washington, it's nice to, we love our acronyms, so we've called this the axis of upheaval or the axis of aggressors or whatever, and we rack and stack it a little bit differently. Some people include North Korea in the equation, some people even include Venezuela. These are supporting actors, as far as I know. The 3 legs of the stool, as far as I'm concerned, are China, Russia, and Iran. And the way they're moving about is complementary because nothing that China does in the Indo-Pacific affects Iran's imperial reach in the Persian Gulf. And nothing that Iran does in the Persian Gulf impacts, in fact, rebounds to the greatness of both Moscow and Beijing. So there are flashpoints in the future, places like the Russian Far East, where Russia and China may come into conflict, places like Central Asia, where you're already seeing some economic competition. But the vast majority of global affairs right now is driven by complementarity rather than competition. And the shared objective is very clear, and I couldn't say it any better, right? It's not just a Russian objective, but the sowing of distrust, the diminution of support and confidence in the Western-led post-World War II order is an objective of Russia, but it's also an objective that's shared in Tehran. It's also an objective that's shared in Beijing, and it has enormous consequences. So they want different things. So I think it's useful to talk about what the new imperialists want. Russia wants very clearly a restoration of empire. And I say very clearly because here in Washington, it is fashionable, it was very fashionable, it still is in some quarters, to talk about how Vladimir Putin wants to restore the Soviet Union. But if you actually drill down and look at what he's actually said, that's not what he wants. He sees himself much more as a czar than a commissar. And in fact, in a lot of the Russian internal communications, in the speeches that he gives, not to Western audiences, but to Russian audiences, to audiences in the Ruski Mir, right, in the Russian world, he actually heaps a lot of blame on Joseph Stalin. Because Stalin, before he was General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, was the Commissar of Nationalities in the Soviet Union for about 11 years, 12 years. And during that time, the Soviet policy towards different nationalities, and there are many of them in the Soviet Union, was formed, including towards Ukraine. And Putin's main complaint, and he said this in, if you recall, he gave two speeches, one right before the full-scale invasion, in which he explained what he was going to do, and then one right after explaining what he just did. And in that first speech, he talked about how Stalin made a mistake because he gave these nationalities too many liberties, and therefore they now think that they're real boys and girls. And so I think that's necessary to understand, because it means that solving the Ukraine conflict is not a simple matter of putting the right clauses on a piece of paper. It is a matter of diminishing and demolishing Russian imperialism. And that's a much heavier lift for the global community. The second is China. And China, in a very, or sort of very similar, very aligned way, is trying to restore imperial greatness. If you look at the arc of Chinese foreign policy ideologically since Xi Jinping took the reins of the Chinese Communist Party in late 2012, you will see a tremendous emphasis on restoring and rebalancing after the century of humiliation. The Chinese talk about it all the time in their internal writings, and they talk about, and I'm going to butcher the Chinese, right? The Tiansha, the all under heaven concept, and they use that concept as an orienting frame for their Belt and Road foreign policy initiative. And I think that's important because a lot of your countries are dealing with, either directly or indirectly, the engagement with Beijing that comes along with this massive infusion of trade and commerce and infrastructure deals that come along with the Belt and Road. But let's be clear, that's only part of the story. What the Chinese are doing is they're building an empire of dependency. And that empire of dependency, very naturally, in places that cannot repay these predatory debts, is creating leverage for the Chinese that they will use to erode sovereignty, to forward deploy their military, to do things that rebound to the detriment of local countries, but rebound to the benefit of the Chinese Communist Party and its allies. And the third is Iran. And Iran is a little bit of a different animal because Iran is at least partially cut down to size over the last 6 months. But if you go back and you look at the arc of Iranian foreign policy from the Second Gulf War forward, it's very clear that what Iran was trying to do and had managed to do very successfully up until this summer was not just to build the ring of fire around Israel, but also to expand its strategic reach and to build an incipient empire. Not an empire of territory, but also an empire of influence in places like Yemen, in places like Iraq, in places like Lebanon and Syria, and to connect them together. And that's why Iranian parliamentarians already a decade ago were talking about how Iran controls 4 capitals in the region, and the number is growing. So this is an active front right now. They've been set back on their heels, but very, very clearly, this is an expression of what Iran, of how Iran sees itself. And the political scientist Graham Fuller, back in 1994, wrote a book called The Center of the Universe, talking about Iran's strategic culture. And I would posit that's still a very good way to think about Iran. Iran believes that it is the geopolitical center of the Middle East around which regional politics should oscillate. And that's why there is so much reaction when Iran acts in the region. So they're achieving this in multiple ways, right? We see the most overt signs. You saw the most overt signs, right? The trilateral naval exercises, collaborative basing in what's colloquially known as the Global South. But they're also doing it in economic terms. The de-dollarization, the push through the BRICS system to try to do transactions not in dollar-denominated currencies, but to do it in the Chinese RMB, for example. They're also doing it, I think, very tellingly in the disinformation space. You saw this very manifestly during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the narratives about trust in Western vaccines or lack of trust in Western vaccines the narrative about COVID as a bioweapon ricocheted around the infosphere, driven by Russian disinformation first, but picked up by Chinese and Iranian information actors second. And they've amplified, and they've continued. And here, I would argue, the central front for the coming decade is Africa, because Africa is the world's youngest continent. It has the most robust fertility rate, and the population of Africa is going to double to 2.5 billion people in the next 30 years. Africa right now is 40% connected to the internet. By 2040, it will be 80% connected. So I confess I'm terrible at mathematics, but that seems to me something like 800 million to 1 billion new informational consumers. And we have to be in a position to message to them, because the Chinese are. The Chinese are reaching out with the Belt and Road. The Chinese are building satellites to provide space-based internet and low latency data. And if the Chinese choose the channels, American channels will not be on the TV sets. And that gets us to what we can do about it, right? And I think here, I think it's very important to understand that our answer, the American answer, begins with deterrence. But our deterrence is only as good as our allies. And here, we have a lot of work to do. And I tend to take a different view than the administration does about the need to disengage. I agree with the administration entirely that we need to pressure for greater activism, for greater investment. But there's a lot of work to be done. I just came back from a trip to Lithuania, and I had a briefing from the NATO Forward Deployed Command there. And they told me a fascinating thing, which I would venture to guess the majority of you don't know. Right now, by the way, we're almost 4 years into the Ukraine conflict. Right now, for NATO to do large-scale deliveries of battlefield kit, right, armored personnel carriers and tanks, from the west of the European continent to the east of the European continent takes how long? 45 days at the worst case scenario. 45 days, almost 4 years into an active conflict. So if you're an imperialist sitting in Moscow, and also an imperialist sitting in Tehran or Beijing, and you see this, what you see is a lack of seriousness. You see a lack of seriousness and empty political space that you can fill. And that's something that needs to be changed. And that's the last point. There has to be an understanding that these fronts are organically connected. The Ukraine war is not a Russian-Ukrainian conversation. There are inputs from North Korea in terms of manpower. There are inputs from Iran in terms of drones. There's inputs from China in terms of oil purchases. And by the way, this same model of internationalization is replicated in terms of how the Iranian economy has become internationalized, how the Chinese now have first mover advantage in terms of access to Iranian ports, right? These is an international conversation, and we do ourselves no service by talking about Russia and Ukraine, by talking about China, and by talking about Iran as separate conversations, because they don't see it as separate. So that's where I'll end. I think at the end of last week, the administration dropped its new national security strategy. And I'm sure all of you have read it, and if you haven't, you should. It's an important document, but I think it falls short in one critical way. Because very much in keeping with the way the administration is thinking about the world, as we've all seen over the last year, very heavy emphasis on economic prosperity and transactionalism. What's missing here is that there are countries, and I would argue Russia's one, and China's one, and Iran is one, that value ideology over profit. And those countries are going to be America's greatest challenge over the next several years. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. You were going to tell us about, you've got a book coming out for the holidays?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. The plug. So the book is called The New Imperialists, right? You can actually find it on Amazon now. The beauty of on-demand publishing is you can get the Kindle right now. You should all do that. But you could also get the book, and it'll be at your houses or apartments in time for the holidays. So it's wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. We have, thank you so much. Great discussion. Senator.